The hammer came down hard against the red-hot iron, and sparks flew into the dark air like tiny dying stars that vanished before they could reach the ceiling of the old workshop. Cale wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand and stared at the bent piece of metal he had been struggling with for the last 2 hours. It was supposed to become a fine sword blade for one of the village guards, but instead it looked more like a twisted branch ripped from a dying tree. He let out a long breath and dropped the hammer onto the stone floor, where it landed with a dull thud that echoed through the small room. "You are thinking too much again," said Master Doran from the far corner, without even lifting his eyes from the leather strap he was stitching together with thick thread. "A blade does not care about your troubles, boy. It only cares about the heat and the rhythm of the strike." Cale nodded slowly, but he knew the old blacksmith was right. He had not been able to focus on anything for the past 3 days. Ever since the dreams had started, everything felt different. The world around him looked the same, but something deep inside his chest had shifted, like a door had been opened that he could not close again. The dreams were always the same. He would find himself standing in a vast empty field, under a sky filled with 2 moons, one silver and one burning orange. The grass beneath his feet was black as coal, and in the distance there stood a base castle made of dark stone with windows that glowed like the eyes of some ancient beast. A voice would call his name from inside the castle walls, but every time he tried to walk toward it, the ground would crack open and swallow him whole. Then he would wake up gasping for air, with his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He had not told anyone about the dreams, not Master Doran, and certainly not the other boys in the village, who already thought he was strange enough. Had always been different from the others. He had no family that he knew of. Master Doran had found him as a baby, wrapped in a burned cloth at the edge of the Ashwood Forest 17 years ago. The old man had taken him in and raised him as his own, teaching him the trade of shaping metal and fire. "Go get some air," Doran said, finally putting down his work and looking at Cale with those deep gray eyes that always seemed to see more than they should. "You are no good to me, or that blade tonight." Cale did not argue. He pulled off his heavy leather apron and hung it on the iron hook by the door, then stepped outside into the cool night. The village of Thornfield was quiet at this hour. Most of the farmers and their families had gone to bed hours ago, and the only light came from the oil lamps that hung outside the tavern at the end of the main road. The air smelled of pine and wet earth, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out into the darkness. Real direction, letting his feet carry him along the familiar dirt paths that wound between the small wooden houses and animal pens. He had walked these paths 1,000 times before, but tonight everything felt different. The shadows seemed deeper, and the silence felt heavy, as if the whole world was holding its breath and waiting for something. His feet brought him to the edge of the village, where the last few houses gave way to open fields, and beyond them the dark wall of the Ashwood Forest rose up, like a barrier between the known world and whatever lay beyond it. The villagers never went into the forest, not since the old stories began to spread about the things that lived among those ancient trees. But tonight the forest was calling to him. Cale could feel it, like a pull at his chest, a gentle tug that grew stronger with every step he took toward the tree line. It was the same feeling he got in his dreams, right before the voice called his name. And go back to the workshop, and forget about it. But his legs kept moving forward, as if they had a mind of their own. He crossed the last field and stepped into the shadow of the first trees. The air changed immediately. It was warmer inside the forest, which made no sense because the night was cold. The trees were enormous, with trunks wider than houses, and branches that stretched so high they blocked out the sky completely. A faint blue light seemed to glow from somewhere deep within the moss that covered the ground, giving everything an eerie, dreamlike quality. Kale walked deeper into the forest, following the pull in his chest. The blue glow grew brighter with every step, and soon he realized it was not coming from the moss at all. It was coming from him. He stopped and looked down at his hands. They were glowing. A soft blue light pulsed beneath his skin, like veins of liquid fire running through his body. He turned his palms over and watched in stunned silence as the light grew, stronger and brighter, until it was shining out between his fingers like sunlight through cracks in a wall. "What is happening to me?" he whispered. "You are waking up," said a voice from the darkness ahead. Kale stumbled backward and nearly fell over a thick root. His heart jumped into his throat, and he raised his glowing hands in front of him, as if they could somehow protect him from whatever was out there. A figure stepped out from behind one of the massive trees. It was a woman, tall and slender, with long silver hair that fell past her shoulders like a waterfall of moonlight. She wore armor made of a dark metal that Kale had never seen before, and on her back she carried a sword with a blade that seemed to be made of pure white light. Her eyes were the strangest thing about her. They were bright gold, like two coins catching the sun, and they watched him with a mixture of sadness and something that looked almost like hope. "Who are you?" Kale asked, his voice shaking. "My name is Lyra," she said, and her voice was calm and steady, like someone who had been waiting a very long time for this moment. "And I have been searching for you for 17 years, Kale. How do you know my name?" She took a step closer, and the light from his hands reflected off her armor, casting strange patterns on the trees around them. "Because I am the one who brought you to this village when you were just a baby," she said, "and because the kingdom you were born in is dying, and you are the only one who can save it." Kale stared at her, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything except stand there in the blue glow of his own hands, while the entire world he thought he knew came crashing down around him like a castle made of sand. The forest was silent. The blue light pulsed beneath his skin, and somewhere far away, beyond the trees and the fields and the mountains he could not yet see, a dark castle with glowing windows waited for the boy who had finally begun to wake up. He sat on a fallen log at the edge of the ashwood forest, while Lyra stood a few feet away, watching the darkness between the trees, as if she expected something dangerous to come crawling out at any moment. The blue glow in his hands had faded, but he could still feel it buzzing under his skin, like a swarm of bees trapped inside his bones. "Tell me everything," he said, finally breaking the silence that had stretched between them for what felt like hours. Lyra turned to face him, and the gold of her eyes caught the faint starlight that filtered through the canopy above. She sat down on the mossy ground across from him, and rested her hands on her knees. "There is a kingdom," she began, "far beyond the mountains to the north, beyond the endless mist that no ordinary traveler can pass through. It is called Ember, and it is the last kingdom of magic left in this world." She paused and let that sink in, before continuing. "Thousands of years ago, magic was everywhere, through the rivers and the air and the blood of every living creature. But over time, the world changed. People forgot how to use it, and the magic began to fade. It retreated to the places where it was still honored and protected, and eventually it gathered in one final stronghold, the Kingdom of Ember." Kale listened without interrupting, though his mind was racing with 100 questions. Ember was ruled by the Flame Throne, a seat of power that drew its strength from a source deep beneath the castle, called the Heart of Ember. It was a crystal as large as a house that burned with a fire that never went out. For centuries, the kings and queens of Ember protected this crystal, and in return, the crystal gave them power and kept the kingdom alive and safe. "What happened?" Kale asked, already sensing that the story was about to take a dark turn. 20 years ago, a man named Varen rose to power within the kingdom. He was the king's most trusted advisor, and the most gifted sorcerer in all of Ember. But his hunger for power was greater than anyone realized. He believed that the heart of Ember was being wasted on protecting the kingdom. He wanted to use its full power to reshape the entire world and make himself a god. Lyra's voice grew heavier as she spoke, and Kale could see the pain in her golden eyes. Varen betrayed the king and queen. He led an army of shadow creatures that he had been secretly creating in the tunnels beneath the castle. They attacked during the Festival of Flames, when the people were celebrating in the streets. The king and queen fought back with everything they had, but Varen was too powerful. He killed the king with a blade forged from shadow itself, and he captured the queen. "And what about the crystal?" Kale asked. Varen tried to take it, but the heart of Ember rejected him. It could sense the darkness in his soul, and it refused to give him its full power. In a rage, he wrapped the crystal in chains of dark magic. Could not destroy it, but he could slowly drain its energy. And that is exactly what he has been doing for the past 20 years. She looked at Kale with an intensity that made him feel like she was looking straight through him. "The kingdom is dying, Kale. The magic that once made Ember shine like a second sun is fading. The forests are turning to ash. The rivers are drying up. The people who still live there are trapped behind Varen's walls, too weak and too afraid to fight back. The heart of Ember grows dimmer with every passing day, and when its light finally goes out, the last magic in this world will die with it." Kale felt the weight of her words pressing down on his shoulders, like a physical force. He wanted to ask the obvious question, the one that had been burning in his mind since she first appeared, but he was afraid of the answer. He asked it anyway. "What does any of this have to do with me?" Lyra stood and walked closer to him. She knelt down so that her tears looked down on her. Eyes were level with his, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "The king and queen of Ember had a son, a baby born on the night of the attack. When the castle was falling and the shadows were pouring through every door and window, the queen used the last of her strength to send the child away. She wrapped him in a cloth woven with protective fire magic, and she gave him to the one person she trusted most in the world. She placed her hand on her own chest. She gave him to me. And I carried that child through the endless mist, across the mountains, and through the ashwood forest, until I found a small, quiet village, where no one would ever think to look for the lost Prince of Ember." The world went very still. Kale could hear his own heartbeat, loud and slow in his ears. He could feel the blood rushing through his veins, and with it, that strange blue light that pulsed and hummed, as if it had been waiting his entire life for this moment. "Prince," he said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they sounded hollow. "You are the son of King Aldrich and Queen Seraphina of the Kingdom of Ember," Lyra said firmly. "The blood of the Flame Throne runs in your veins. That is why your hands glow. That is why you have been having the dreams. The heart of Ember is calling to you, because you are the only one it will answer to. You are the only one who can break Varen's chains and restore the crystal's power." Kale stood up so fast that his head spun. He paced back and forth on the forest floor, his boots crunching on dead leaves and twigs. "This is madness," he said, running his hands through his dark hair. "I am a blacksmith's apprentice. I cannot even make a proper sword blade. How am I supposed to fight some dark sorcerer and save an entire kingdom?" "You are more than you think you are," Lyra said, standing as well. "The power inside you is the same power that built Ember. The same fire that burns in the heart of the crystal burns in you. You just need to learn how to use it. And how long will that take? We do not have long. The heart of Ember will go dark within 30 days. If that happens, there will be nothing left to save." Kale stopped pacing and looked back toward Thornfield. The lights of the tavern had gone out, and the village was completely dark and silent. He thought about Master Doran, who had raised him and fed him and taught him everything he knew. He thought about the simple life he had always imagined for himself, a life of fire and iron and honest work. But then he felt the pull in his chest again, that tug towards something greater, something ancient and powerful that he could not explain. And he thought about the dream, about the castle with its glowing windows, and the voice calling his name. Maybe it had never been a dream at all. Maybe it had been a memory. "If I go with you," he said slowly, "what happens?" "We travel north through the ashwood, and, across the gray mountains, we pass through the endless mist and into ember. Along the way I will teach you what I can about your power. But I will not lie to you, Kale. The journey will be dangerous. Varen has spies everywhere, and he has been hunting for you since the night you disappeared. If he finds out that you are still alive, he will send everything he has to stop you." Kale looked down at his hands. The blue glow had returned, faint but steady like embers in a dying fire. He thought about fear, and he thought about courage, and he realized that maybe they were not so different after all. Maybe courage was just fear that had decided to keep walking. "I will go with you," he said. Lyra's golden eyes softened, and for just a moment, he thought he saw the shadow of a smile cross her face. "Then we leave at dawn," she said. "Say your goodbyes quickly. We cannot afford to waste a single hour." Kale nodded and turned back toward the village. He did not know what waited for him beyond the mountains. He did not know if he was strong enough, or brave enough, or anything enough to do what needed to be done. But the fire in his veins was burning, and the castle in his dreams was waiting. And for the first time in his life, the boy who had never known where he came from finally had a direction to walk toward. He stood in the doorway of the workshop, just before sunrise, watching Master Doran stoke the morning fire in the forge. The old man moved slowly these days, his joints stiff and his back bent from decades of leaning over the anvil. But his hands were still steady, and his eyes still sharp. And when he turned to look at Kale, he already knew. "You are leaving," Doran said. It was not a question. "How did you know?" The old blacksmith let out a quiet laugh, and sat down on the wooden stool near the fire. He rubbed his rough, calloused hands together, and stared into the flames for a long moment before speaking. "I have been waiting for this day, since I found you in that burned cloth at the edge of the forest," he said. "I always knew you were not an ordinary child. The way metal responded to your touch, the way fire never burned you, even when you stuck your hand right into the coals when you were barely 3 years old. I did not know exactly what you were, but I knew that one day someone would come for you." Kale felt a lump rise in his throat. He crossed the room and knelt beside the old man who had been the closest thing to a father he had ever known. "You could have told me," he said softly. "And what would I have said?" Doran replied with a sad smile. "That you were special, that you were meant for something greater than hammering horseshoes in a forgotten village. You needed to grow up first, Kale. You needed to learn patience and discipline and the value of hard work. Those things will serve you far better than any magic ever could." Doran reached behind the forge and pulled out something wrapped in old cloth. He placed it in Kale's hands and nodded for him to open it. Inside was a dagger unlike anything Kale had ever seen. The blade was short, no longer than his forearm, but it was made of a metal that shimmered between silver and deep blue, like moonlight reflecting off dark water. The handle was wrapped in black leather, and at the base of the blade a small symbol was etched into the metal. A flame inside a circle. "I found this with you," Doran said, "wrapped in that same burned cloth. It is not made of any metal I have ever worked with. I could not sharpen it or reshape it or even scratch it. I think it was made for you and only you." Kale held the dagger up and watched the light from the forge dance across its surface. The moment his fingers closed around the handle, he felt a warmth spread up his arm and into his chest, and the blue glow beneath his skin flared briefly before settling down again. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt impossibly small for everything he wanted to say. Doran placed his heavy hand on Cale's shoulder and squeezed. "Go save whatever needs saving, boy. And when you are done, come home and finish that sword blade. You still owe me 3 days of work." Cale laughed, despite the tears that were threatening to fall. He embraced the old man one last time. The door into the gray morning light, where Lyra was already waiting. They left Thornfield before the rest of the village woke, and headed north into the Ashwood Forest. The forest was different during the day. Sunlight filtered through the enormous canopy in golden shafts that illuminated patches of moss and fern on the ground. Small creatures darted between the roots of the ancient trees, and birds sang high above, in voices that sounded almost like words in a language Cale could not quite understand. Lyra moved through the trees with the confidence of someone who had traveled this path many times before. She walked quickly and quietly, her hand resting on the hilt of her glowing sword at all times. "We need to reach the northern edge of the forest by nightfall," she said without looking back. "Beyond that, the gray mountains begin, and the real danger starts." "What kind of danger?" Cale asked, jogging slightly to keep up with her long strides. "Creatures. The ones he used to attack Ember 20 years ago. He has created more since then, many more. They patrol the mountains and the endless mist, searching for anyone who tries to enter or leave the kingdom. They are made of pure dark magic, and they cannot be killed by ordinary weapons." She glanced at the dagger hanging from his belt. "But that blade you carry is not ordinary. It was forged by your mother, using the fire of the heart of Ember itself. It is one of the few weapons in this world that can destroy shadow creatures." Cale touched the dagger instinctively and felt its warmth pulse against his hip. They walked for hours, barely stopping to rest. Lyra used the time to begin teaching him about his power. She explained that the blue light inside him was called the Ember Flame, and it was the same energy that powered the heart of Ember. Every king and queen of the Flame Throne carried this fire in their blood, and it gave them the ability to do things that ordinary people would call impossible. "The Ember Flame responds to your emotions and your will," she said, as they crossed a shallow stream that cut through the forest floor. "When you are afraid, it shrinks. When you are angry, it burns hot and wild. When you are focused and calm, it becomes something you can shape and direct, like a blacksmith shapes metal." "Like hammering iron," Cale said, understanding the comparison immediately. "Exactly," Lyra said, and this time she actually smiled. "Your years at the forge were not wasted, Cale. The discipline you learned there is exactly what you need to control your power. Think of the Ember Flame as raw metal. It is powerful but shapeless. Until you learn to heat it and strike it and bend it to your will, it is useless." They practiced as they walked. Lyra taught him to close his eyes and feel the fire inside his chest. She taught him to breathe slowly and draw the heat outward through his arms and into his hands. Grew frustrated. But Lyra reminded him of what Doran had always said about patience, and eventually he managed to produce a small ball of blue flame that hovered above his palm for a few seconds before flickering out. "That is good," Lyra said. "Very good for a first attempt." It was tiny. Everything starts small. Even the heart of Ember was once just a spark. By late afternoon, the trees began to thin and the ground started to slope upward. Through the gaps in the canopy, Cale could see the peaks of the gray mountains rising ahead of them, jagged and dark against the pale sky. They looked like the teeth of some massive creature, frozen in stone, and even from this distance, Cale could feel a coldness radiating from them that had nothing to do with the weather. "We camp here tonight," Lyra said, stopping in a small clearing where a ring of stones suggested that others had made camp before. "We enter the mountains at first light. Tomorrow we'll test everything you." They built a small fire and ate dried meat and bread that Lyra had brought in her pack. Kale sat close to the flames, watching the shadows dance at the edges of the clearing. He could not help but feel that those shadows were watching him back. "Lyra," he said after a long silence, "is my mother still alive?" The warrior woman was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was careful and measured. "When I left Ember, the queen was Varen's prisoner. He kept her alive because he believed she knew secrets about the heart of Ember that could help him unlock its full power. Whether she is still alive after all these years, I honestly do not know." Kale stared into the fire and felt the ember flame inside him pulse with a new emotion. Something hot and fierce and determined. "Then we find out," he said. Lyra looked at him across the fire, and in the dancing light, her golden eyes reflected something that Kale was only beginning to recognize. Himself. It was the look of someone who had found a reason to fight. Above them the stars turned slowly across the sky, and to the north, beyond the mountains, the darkness over the kingdom of Ember grew a little deeper as the heart of the crystal pulsed one shade dimmer than it had the night before. The rock was dark and sharp, and the paths that wound between the peaks were narrow and crumbling. Freezing wind howled through the passes, like the screaming of something trapped and angry. The air grew thinner the higher they climbed, and Kale's lungs burned with every breath. But the cold was not the worst part. On the second day in the mountains, the shadow creatures found them. Kale heard them before he saw them, a sound like whispering voices overlapping and tangling together into something that was not quite language and not quite silence. It came from everywhere at once, bouncing off the stone walls of the narrow pass they were walking through. Lyra stopped immediately and drew her sword. The white blade hummed with light, and she held it in front of her with both hands, her golden eyes scanning the rocks above them. "Stay behind me," she said, her voice low and tight, "and keep your hand on that dagger." They came pouring over the ridge like black smoke. Given form, there were 5 of them, each one a twisting, shapeless mass of darkness with eyes that burned red like hot coals. They moved with a horrible, fluid speed, slithering across the rocks and leaving trails of frost wherever they touched. Lyra moved like lightning. She lunged forward and swung her sword in a wide arc that cut through the first shadow creature with a flash of white light. The creature let out a shriek that made Kale's teeth rattle in his skull, and then it exploded into a shower of black sparks that faded into nothing. But the other 4 were already closing in. 2 of them rushed at Lyra from opposite sides, and she spun between them, her sword singing through the air as she fought with a skill and speed that Kale could barely follow. She destroyed one with a thrust through its center, but the other caught her arm with a tendril of darkness, and she cried out in pain as ice spread across her armor. The remaining 2 turned toward Kale, backward, and his back hit the cold stone wall of the pass. There was nowhere to run. The creatures drifted toward him slowly, as if they were enjoying his fear. Their red eyes burned into his, and the whispering grew louder, filling his head with a sound that made it hard to think. His hand found the dagger at his belt, and he pulled it free. The blade immediately began to glow with a fierce blue light that pushed back the shadows around him. The creatures hesitated, and for a moment Kale felt a flash of hope. Then they lunged. Kale acted on instinct. He swung the dagger in front of him, and the blade cut through the first creature like it was made of paper. The thing dissolved with a scream, and Kale felt a rush of heat flood through his body as the ember flame inside him roared to life. The second creature wrapped itself around his left arm, and the cold was immediate and agonizing. It felt like plunging his arm into ice water and holding it there while needles drove into his skin. But through the pain, Kale felt something else. The fire inside him was pushing back against the cold, fighting the darkness with a heat that came from somewhere deep inside his core. He grabbed the shadow creature with his glowing hand and squeezed. Blue fire erupted from his fingers and engulfed the creature in flames. The thing thrashed and writhed, and then it was gone, leaving nothing behind but a wisp of dark smoke that the mountain wind carried away. Kale stood there, panting and shaking, with his dagger in one hand, and blue fire still licking around the fingers of the other. He looked at Lyra, who had finished off the last creature, and was clutching her injured arm. Her armor was cracked where the shadow had touched it, and dark frost covered the metal beneath. "Are you all right?" he asked, rushing to her side. "I will be fine," she said through gritted teeth. "Shadow wounds heal slowly, but they heal." She looked at him, and despite the pain, there was admiration in her eyes. Her golden eyes. "You did well, Kale. Better than I expected. You used the ember flame without even thinking about it." "I did not have time to think. Sometimes that is the best way to learn." They pushed forward through the mountains, moving faster now. Lyra said the shadow creatures would report back to Varen, and that more would come. The element of surprise was gone, and they needed to reach the endless mist before Varen could send a larger force. On the third night in the mountains, they reached the northern edge, and Kale saw the endless mist for the first time. It stretched across the entire horizon, a wall of gray and white fog, so thick that it looked almost solid. It rose from the ground like steam from a boiling pot, and climbed up into the sky until it merged with the clouds above. There was no visible end to it in any direction, and the air near it felt strange and heavy, as if reality itself was thinner here. "The endless mist is a barrier," Lyra explained, as they stood at its edge. "It was created by the first rulers of Ember to hide the kingdom from the outside world. Ordinary people who walk into it become lost. They wander in circles until they walk right back out again. Or worse, they wander forever." "How do we get through?" "With that," she said, pointing to the dagger in his hand. "The blade was forged with the fire of the heart. It is like a compass that always points toward Ember. As long as you hold it and follow where it leads, the mist cannot confuse you." Kale drew the dagger and held it out in front of him. The blue glow in the blade shifted and pulsed, and he felt a gentle pull toward the left, as if an invisible hand was guiding his arm. "I feel it," he said. "Then lead the way, Your Majesty," Lyra said, and there was no humor in her voice, only respect. They stepped into the mist. The world disappeared. The moment they crossed the threshold, everything vanished. The mountains, the sky, the stars, all of it. Gone. There was only gray. White and gray swirling around them so thick that Kale could barely see Lyra walking right beside him. Sound became muffled, as if the fog was swallowing every noise before it could reach their ears. But the dagger knew the way. It pulled him forward through the blinding nothing with a steady, patient tug, and Kale followed it, one step at a time. They walked for what felt like hours, though it was impossible to tell time inside the mist. Kale's sense of direction was completely gone, and if not for the dagger, he knew he would have been hopelessly lost within minutes. Then gradually, the mist began to thin. Light appeared ahead of them, not sunlight, but something warmer and more golden, like the glow of 1,000 lanterns seen through fog. The pull of the dagger grew stronger, and Kale walked faster, his heart pounding with anticipation. They broke through the last curtain of mist, and Kale stopped dead in his tracks. Valley surrounded on all sides by towering black mountains. In the center of the valley stood a city, but it was unlike any city he had ever imagined or heard about. The buildings were made of dark stone and crystal, and they rose in spiraling towers that reached toward a sky lit by 2 moons, one silver and one burning orange, the same sky from his dreams. But something was terribly wrong. The city that should have been shining with magical light was mostly dark. The crystal towers were cracked and dull. The streets below looked empty, and the once magnificent castle at the center of the city sat beneath a swirling mass of black clouds that churned and crackled with dark energy, like a storm that never ended. "Welcome to Ember," Lyra said quietly, and her voice carried the weight of someone returning to a home they barely recognized, or what is left of it. Kale stared at the broken kingdom and felt the ember flame inside him burn hotter than it ever had before. Home, this was where he was born, and the man who had destroyed it was sitting in that castle right now, draining the last light from the heart of the crystal. When Kale and Lyra descended into the valley and approached the outer edges of the city, they were met by a small group of ragged men and women, hiding among the ruins of what had once been a marketplace. Their clothes were torn and dirty, and their faces were thin from years of hunger. But their eyes lit up the moment they saw Lyra, and when she told them who Kale was, a silence fell over the group that was heavier than any words could have been. An old woman with white hair and trembling hands stepped forward and looked at Kale for a long time. Then she reached out and touched his face with her rough fingers, and tears began to roll down her wrinkled cheeks. "You have your mother's eyes," she whispered. "We thought you were dead. We all thought you were dead." Word spread quickly through the hidden network of survivors who lived in the shadows of the ruined city. By nightfall, Kale found himself standing in an underground chamber beneath what had once been a great library, surrounded by nearly 100 people who looked at him as if he were the sun rising after 20 years of darkness. About Varen and the castle. The dark sorcerer had sealed himself inside the throne room at the heart of the castle, where the Heart of Ember sat beneath its chains of dark magic. He had created an army of shadow creatures that patrolled the city and guarded every entrance to the castle. The only way in was through the old tunnels beneath the city, which had been built centuries ago as an escape route for the royal family. Most of the tunnels had collapsed, but Finn had found one that was still passable. "It leads to the lower levels of the castle," Finn said, tracing the route on a crude map drawn on the back of a piece of leather. "From there you can reach the throne room, but the tunnels are narrow and dark, and shadow creatures patrol them too." "How many shadow creatures are we talking about?" Kale asked. "Hundreds," Bram said grimly. "Maybe more. Varen has been creating them non-stop for 20 years. The city is crawling with them." "Then we need a distraction," Lyra said, leaning over the map. "Something big enough to draw the creatures away from the castle, so Kale can get through the tunnels." A plan took shape over the next several hours. The resistance fighters would launch an attack on the eastern wall of the city, creating as much noise and chaos as possible to draw Varen's forces away from the castle. Meanwhile, Kale and Lyra would enter the tunnels from a hidden entrance near the old river and make their way to the throne room. Sarah would go with them to provide healing in case they were wounded, and Finn would guide them through the underground passages. It was not a perfect plan. There were too many things that could go wrong, and everyone in the room knew it. But it was the only plan they had, and the clock was ticking. They moved at midnight. Bram and the resistance fighters took their positions along the eastern wall, armed with torches and whatever weapons they could find. Old swords, rusted axes, farming tools sharpened into spears. They were not an army. They were farmers and shopkeepers and children who had grown up in the ruins of a broken kingdom. But they stood shoulder to shoulder in the darkness, and when Bram gave the signal, they charged. The noise was incredible. Shouts and crashes and the sound of steel hitting stone echoed through the empty streets, and within moments the shadow creatures responded. Hundreds of dark shapes streamed toward the eastern wall, like a black river flowing through the city, leaving the castle entrance exposed. "Now," Lyra said. They ran. Finn led them through a gap in a crumbled wall and down a flight of stone stairs that disappeared into the earth below. The tunnel was exactly as he had described it, narrow and dark and cold, with walls that dripped with moisture, and a ceiling so low that Kale had to duck his head as he ran. The blue glow of his dagger lit the way, casting shifting shadows on the rough stone. They encountered two shadow creatures in the tunnels. Kale destroyed the first one with a blast of ember flame that erupted from his palm with more force than he had ever produced before. The second one, Lyra cut down with her sword before it could even attack. They reached the lower levels of the castle and climbed a winding staircase that seemed to go on forever, until finally they emerged through a heavy iron door into a massive hallway, lined with cracked pillars and shattered windows. And at the end of that hallway was the throne room. The doors were enormous, made of black iron, carved with symbols that writhed and shifted as if they were alive. Dark energy radiated from them in waves that made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. "This is as far as I go," Lyra said, and Kale turned to look at her in shock. "The throne room will only respond to royal blood. If I try to enter, Varen's wards will destroy me. I cannot do this alone." "You are not alone," she said, placing her hand on his chest, where the ember flame still flickered dimly. Flame burned beneath his skin. "You have never been alone. The fire of every king and queen who ever sat on the flame throne lives inside you. All you have to do is let it out." She stepped back and drew her sword. "I will hold the door. Go." Kale turned to face the enormous doors. He placed his hands against the cold iron and pushed. The doors resisted for a moment, and then the symbols on their surface flared blue as they recognized the blood of the flame throne, and they swung open with a deep grinding sound that shook the walls. The throne room was vast and dark. The ceiling rose so high it disappeared into shadow, and the floor was made of black marble that reflected the faint glow of the chains wrapped around the heart of ember. The crystal was there in the center of the room. It was as large as a house, just as Lyra had described, but its light was almost gone. A faint flicker of orange still pulsed deep within it, but the chains of dark magic that covered it were choking the life out of it, one heartbeat at a time. And standing before the crystal was Varen. He was tall and thin, with skin so pale it was almost gray. His eyes were completely black, with no white at all, and they fixed on Kale with a cold intelligence that made the boy feel like a mouse being watched by a hawk. He wore robes of pure shadow that moved and shifted around his body like living darkness. "So," Varen said, and his voice echoed through the chamber like the sound of breaking glass, "the lost prince returns. I have been expecting you." Kale drew his dagger and felt the ember flame surge through his entire body. His hands blazed with blue fire, and his eyes glowed with a light that pushed back the shadows around him. "Let my mother go," he said, and his voice did not shake, "and release the heart of ember." Varen smiled, and it was the most terrible thing Kale had ever seen. "Make me," he said. The battle was unlike anything Kale could have imagined. Varen hurled bolts of black lightning that cracked the marble floor and sent chunks of stone flying through the air. Kale dodged and rolled and fought back with blasts of ember flame that collided with Varen's dark magic in explosions of blue and black light. He was knocked down again and again. Each time he hit the ground, the breath was driven from his lungs, and his body screamed at him to stay down. But each time he thought of Doran and Lyra and the people fighting outside and the mother he had never known, and he got back up. He remembered what Doran had taught him about patience and rhythm. He remembered what Lyra had taught him about focus and will, and he realized that this was just like forging a blade. The fire was hot, and the metal was stubborn, but if he kept striking with patience and purpose, it would eventually bend. Kale closed his eyes and reached deep inside himself, deeper than he had ever gone before. He found the ember flame not as a small spark, but as a blazing inferno that filled every part of his being. He gathered it all together, and with a scream that came from somewhere beyond words, he released it. A pillar of blue fire erupted from his body and slammed into Varen with the force of a falling mountain. The dark sorcerer's shields shattered like glass, and the fire consumed the shadows around him, burning away 20 years of darkness in a single blinding moment. Varen screamed, and the chains around the heart of Ember cracked and shattered into 1,000 pieces. Light exploded from the crystal. A wave of golden fire swept through the throne room and out through the walls and windows of the castle, washing over the entire kingdom like a sunrise that had been held back for 2 decades. The shadow creatures in the streets dissolved into nothing. The dark clouds above the castle broke apart, and the 2 moons shone down on Ember for the first time in 20 years. When the light faded, Kale was on his knees, gasping for breath. Varen was gone. Nothing remained of him but a scorch mark on the marble floor. The heart of Ember blazed with renewed fire, filling the throne room with warmth and light. And from a door behind the crystal, a woman emerged, thin and pale, but alive, with eyes that were the exact same shade as Kale's own. "My son," she said. And Kale, who had been brave through everything, finally let the tears fall. The kingdom of Ember was saved, the last magic in the world burned bright once more, and the boy who had started as a blacksmith's apprentice in a forgotten village had found something far more valuable than a throne.